I'll ask you don't skip the intro because I feel it's very important, but I can't stop you, so if you intend to, here's a timestamp of where to go. Hey, if you somehow recognize my voice and my cadence, you may be wondering why I'm putting this video here. It's not to hide my identity, as this would be a piss poor way of doing so, especially since I've left plenty of digital footprints. The intention here is to put this somewhere more appropriate and to make a point. This isn't for clout, it's because this course of events have been eating away at me for 4 years now. I'm sick and tired of people acting like stuff like this doesn't happen. In the description, assuming this is the original, is a Google Doc link of all the amassed sources for this project. I'd appreciate it if you held on to them if you can. Below that is a link to download the video, with or without the background music, in case anything were to happen to the original. Nothing's immortal. It goes without saying, but I don't care if I'm cited for any of this. That you and anyone that you show knows more about this is enough to me. To say this is a video motivated by justice for the vindication of the person behind the incident is only partially true, as I can't cloak the blatant hate I hold towards the person responsible for this, Zoe Quinn. Hatred is a hell of a motivator. When someone whose work you admire is severed from any future projects, and the creator is pushed into an abyss of being a social pariah in a butterfly effect of drama, all according to the actions of one person predicated on lies, and said person obviously doesn't care, what else can one feel other than contempt for that person? But wiser men have taught me, hate controls your actions. That seems to be a simple observation, admittedly it is, but one easily forgotten. The anger which hate produces is something that controls what we do, what we avoid, who we interact with, and what we say. I think it is important to be able to hold contempt towards immoral things and people, although the thought feels sour as I was raised in a household where hate was a bad word for exactly these dangers. What is also ideal is to temper those thoughts. To act out of hate and impulse is to be the brute that will only cause more harm to any change that you're seeking to make, and will degrade your sense of character with it as you grow numb with this feeling becoming more and more normal. What can I say, I was raised by hippies. But I preface the video with all of this because I want to be crystal clear with my hatred of Zoe Quinn, and that I mean what I say next despite it. Do not harass this woman. Do not attack them, and do not go after those close to them. I'm not playing coy, I mean this. There's no editing tricks, screen's black. To do these things would be participating in the toxic qualities of mob mentality I'm trying to push against here, and would do nothing but give Zoe more ammo for their professional victimhood. If this video encourages you to do anything in response to the injustices brought from these series of events, make sure that people don't forget that this happened. You don't have to send them this, but keep ties to what happened here. Carry links, save sources, put them on the cloud or a Google Doc if you need to. Don't let people forget this moment. But don't let it make you something you're not. That's enough of that though. We should get to the actual reason why you're here. To really go over this, it's important to set the groundwork by going a bit over Zoe and Alec's history to ensure that you have a comprehensive understanding of exactly what happened. And although I'm not going to go over every event, I'm going to go over key ones of Zoe for establishing their character, and I'll talk about events involving Alec when necessary as well. I've looked everywhere, and I do mean everywhere, to gather this information. I've cross-checked sources and hope to clear the air whenever I can reinforce what I think happened when it's brought up. I think it's pretty obvious with this introduction, but this is going to be really uncomfortable, so buckle up. Let's skip forward a bit into their history in making indie games. Around 2012, Alec, Holowka, and Zoe Quinn have been dating for some time at this point. I couldn't pin exactly when, but April 25th, 2012 was when I had the earliest confirmation as demonstrated with the Indie Function podcast.
So I'm guessing you guys have had this asked 1,000 times, but how did you two meet up?
Twitter.
Yeah.
Alec had been supporting Games Making Games randomly, which freaked me out because this is like right after I had started it. It's like, holy shit, Alec Holowka's like tweeting about us. And he was just like really supportive of the work and trying to get more than 5% of the industry to be women.
They met on Twitter, and during the Indie Function podcast, they talked about their previous works, and by that I mean Alec talked about his achievements in indie game development, creating Aquaria in 2007, which ended up being a grand prize winner in the Independent Gaming Festival that year, and was a musician for multiple games after, one of which being Offspring Fling, a very underrated game I'd like to say. I played it back in high school. Fine times a smile, they're scarce for what's to come. At this point in Zoe's career, she hadn't released anything of note unless you count Jeff Goldblum's staring contest.
I made a game in 2012 called Jeff Goldblum's Staring Contest, which is exactly what it sounds like. And furthermore, in 2012, Frog Fractions, Jim Crawford himself told me that one of the voices was him imitating Jeff Goldblum's laugh.
She had gone into video game development in 2011 after getting into a 6-week course in game programming, and she released her first notable game in early 2013. The game in question was Depression Quest, a text-based adventure game which was unimpressive in its contents even at the time, and even in the realms of text-based adventure games. It's clearly trying to convey a message of the effects of depression, and in doing so doesn't really focus on any gameplay aspects, and hyperfixates on the mechanic that the player wants to do productive or healthy things, implying that the player's depression is impeding them. The only two options that really seem to stick out is whether or not you see a therapist and take your meds. It's an incredibly surface level understanding of depression, arguably a misunderstanding. But this is the review on that game. I just wanted to establish what Zoe's most well-known game tile was when I observed the events around it in more detail later. For now, we have to cover something that occurred a little after Depression Quest's first release, and before its great controversy, and that's the game jam that Zoe was meant to be a part of. Okay, so PepsiCo was having this televised game jam sponsored by Mtn Dew for game developers working in teams to create games. For anyone not familiar with what a game jam is, to put simply, it's an event where a bunch of people, typically indie game devs, build a game from scratch, sometimes in teams. But they typically have somewhere between 24 hours to 3 days to create a product and show off what they've made in such a short period of time. PepsiCo basically wanted to make a reality TV show depicting teams creating indie games and stuff happening behind the scenes before ultimately judging the product. I'm just putting my opinion out there, but on what little I could find, I honestly felt like this idea was tarnished even before Zoe came into the picture, as this was originally meant to be a YouTube series by 11 indie devs out in Los Angeles and using the opportunity to explain the foundations of game development for other aspiring indie game devs. Meanwhile, this seemed like an idea built around the spitballing at a table of a corporate meeting that was trying to gain the interest of a more general gaming audience out of a concept and a circle of developers that are far more niche than that. The original idea seemed a lot more informative and genuine than the twisted vision, which wanted there to be drama, infighting, and physical challenges not really having anything to do with development, and treating this as a theme and not understanding the real tension is crunching out a game and idea in such a short period of time. It was a far cry from the pseudo-documentary it was intended to be, and I suspect it was going to have actual value diluted by the interference from suits and shameless brand plastering. People at the event also stated that those running it wanted to be able to stir up drama and false information that could damage many of the already obscure developers' reputations, and they rightfully criticized these conditions that dolled up the indie development process into something it's not. Thus, they did the smart thing and didn't sign the contract. So said contract was loosened a bit to give the crew more breathing room. According to Polaris' journalist Jared Rosen, they were all flown out to these large luxurious sets with the 4 teams in large Winnebagos, which is nice, but it feels like it misses the essence of indie gaming and really doesn't help with that rising feeling of selling out that many of them had been experiencing here. And I don't think I'm off on that, just from the article. Indie development is small. It is a very closely knit, communicative place bound together by common cause and artistic vision. Everyone knows everyone, and they all understand that the process of creating games isn't a flashy affair. It is a deeply invested journey that requires energy, passion, and thoughtfulness on par with any other artistic medium. This, by contrast, was loud. It was very loud. Beyond anything I would have ever expected to see associated with these people, having known some of them since my earliest days covering games for Static. Robin Arnott, my Robin, who built a chanting-based psychoacoustic game based on an acid trip at Burning Man, standing under a gigantic soda ad. Audriel, who used to make satellites for Lockheed Martin, being stricken back to one so that she could enter and re-enter the room over and over. How would Davey, the guy behind the self-aware existential satire The Stanley Parable, react to the pageantry of this... whatever it was? But to continue on the degradation of this event, JonTron was a guest there as well and argued plenty with Zoe. To no surprise.
The internet is still a place where I find community. It's still a place where I meet, like, even just in my industry, that's like such a big and vital support network and so good for mobilizing people to do good things, like supporting marginalized voices that wouldn't otherwise have a platform, for supporting cool, weirdo artists like me. Like,
which one's more dead?
This is the deadest I ever seen.
But when the tensions rose, they would go out in the hall and talk in private away from the teams, you know, like adults. But they became aware that cameras were everywhere, which, why wouldn't they be? But neither side was comfortable with this. John and Zoe didn't want this drama, especially because in the timeline, this was shortly after the Depression Quest Greenlight drama. Although I don't think Zoe ever posted any examples of the hate mail, Zoe took Depression Quest off of Steam Greenlight and put it back on later that year. There's also sources of members being prodded by the CEO of Protagonist, Maddie Lesham, with questions like, do you think you have an advantage because you have a pretty girl on your team? And do you think the team with women on them are at a disadvantage? My take on the matter is that this stuff was said solely to provoke and get a rise for better reactions for the show. It's terrible that they did this, but I can't help but ask how the hell they didn't see this coming. Not this exact question, but that they would be provoked in this way. I mean, considering that this was a competitively structured game jam that was made to be a reality TV show by a corporation that doesn't really understand gaming. I don't even think this was Maddie's fault. Sure, he would have amplified the problem with his antagonistic behavior, but it was going to be screwed up regardless. He was trying to get shots that he never realistically was going to get. This crash and burning seemed more like the fault of out-of-touch corporate tendrils corrupting a pretty cool idea for an indie gaming event under the presumption that they would act like melodramatic and petty jerks, rather than a bunch of adults with an online presence, personal brand to preserve, and a goal to enrich gaming. Assuming it was as bad as people say, mind you. We only have the word of a handful of people involved and many of them are connected, which we'll get into in more detail later. Speaking of things we'll have to talk about later, I have to mention that eyewitness testimonies are one of the worst forms of evidence. They have the frequent tendency to misremember and misinterpret valuable details and context even in very short periods of time after the incident, and this is assuming the person recounting their testimony is doing so truthfully. It worries me that nobody could be bothered to even get a copy of the first draft of the contract they mocked and disclosed details of. And honestly, who knows how much of it is true and not exaggerated by the few people involved who have documented their experiences. Outtro recounts how she told Maddie what he said was indicative of everything wrong in the industry, that they weren't at an advantage because they had a woman, but because she's a damn fine developer, that their skills gave them the advantage, not her pretty face, while Robin recounts it as Adriel curtly telling Maddie his question is offensive. The only good thing to ultimately come out of it, however, was the exposure to Adriel's game jam with the gimmick of spending all the time crunching on a train, which was way cooler and better coordinated. So was JonTron's game jam with Tom Jackson when they were in the aftermath of PepsiCo's game jam event and basically went, yeah, we could do this better.
This is fun.
Christopher.
As for Zoe, well, before we get too into the details of how that fared and what Game Jam content Zoe was actually tied to after PepsiCo's had crashed, we have to get a bit back into Depression Quest. Because despite the game's releasing before these events, the Steam release took place afterwards, and there are some very telling things that took place during this time. Also, I'm trying to stick on the timeline here. The Steam release came to be on August 11, 2014, which may not seem significant in the moment, but something had just happened to occur on that time. Robin Williams' suicide had been announced near the point of Depression Quest's release, which in the shoes of a game developer making a game centered around depression, I can't say I'm envious of having to address that. I think the right call would have been to announce that yes, we are aware this is unfortunate timing, but we couldn't have possibly planned this. May Robin Williams rest in peace, and we'll say nothing further on the project at the moment to pay our respects. So what Zoe did was talk about how this left her under an ultimatum of releasing at the point she was going to anyway, or delay it. She concluded that delaying a message that some people may need to hear because of a tragedy she is trying to avoid occurred is self-defeating, and stated that it would be released quietly. Which, with how much of the post was talking about our development of Depression Quest, and the release that would be that day, ending off with 3 links, the Depression Quest website, the itch.io version of Depression Quest, and the Steam release, in that order? No. I might be overanalyzing this, and I might be a little furious as I typed this, but I couldn't help but notice that the main topics were Robin Williams and the Steam release of Depression Quest. Yet despite this, she has no links for any articles or videos in respect of Robin Williams, and she had all 3 of her Depression Quest links up. However, the Steam release is the last one, despite being the most relevant to the subject matter. The reason for this is likely because the Steam version is the only version of Depression Quest that does not have a pay what you want option to it. She even talks about it in the Robin Williams post about how she wanted to make DLC tiers for donations, but said it would be unoptimal. Probably because Steam takes a pretty hefty cut. If you really enjoy an indie game and want to buy it, I will say you're supporting the developers more directly if you buy it off itch, which is why I recommend people do so if it has one. But back on track, it's telling to me that in such a major moment of announcement, she prioritized the option that allowed money to be directly given to the game. And so it does announce that in a tweet about a month later that the 24-hour proceedings of Depression Quest's release, as well as the money on their Patreon, went to iFred and the nation's suicide lifeline. But I can't find any sources or receipts to back that up other than the one of them saying they did that, and Zoe had previously went on the record saying that having a middleman for charities is a dumb idea, a point you'll see Zoe flip-flopping around on. Another example will soon be present in the next listed event, and that's the arc of the Fine Young Capitalists. On August 12, 2014, Indiegogo had a campaign set up by the Fine Young Capitalists. They made a contest where a bunch of women with no game developing experience would apply their ideas and concepts for games with the development of teams ran by women in countries with less game development opportunities. This is why they say they have picked to have it developed by the Colombian team Autobotica for the first one to be made. The profit proceeds followed, with 74% of it going to charities. The charities in question are voted on by people who back the game jam. As long as 3 people were pushing for that charity, it would get some kind of cut. 10% would go to Autobotica, 8% went to the woman who came up with the game's idea, and 8% would go to TFYC. From my understanding, this would have been done for 5 winners, and each game would take a year to develop. Zoe had contentions with this idea. She stated that she didn't like that women were working for free to fund TFYC's project, which it doesn't take much research to dispute, and shows how little Zoe actually knew about the project up to this point. Now, the women who win the contest to come up with the game concept not only get 8% of the cut of the profits, but also own the rights to the game that was developed, and Autobotica would get a 10% cut. Women were not working for free. The second fault that Zoe had with the game jam was TFYC policing trans people's identity in the eligibility form. This once again ended up falling completely flat. The social representative of the Fine Young Capitalists explained that the requirement was to have contestants transition to being a woman a deadline shortly before the contest began. It is also apparent in the requirements as listed and mentioned in interviews, transitioning is not limited to a sex change operation in this contest, but a coming out and change of identity.
We use the word, the basic text was, if I self-identify as a woman, can I enter the contest? Yes, as long as you transition before the beginning of the date. The issue wasn't the date as much as that especially Zoe Quinn and the person that she was talking to use a colloquialism that transition means sex change.
This was done under the express purpose of allowing trans women who could not afford a sex change operation, which applied to the overwhelming majority of the world, that they would still be given this opportunity. Because as mentioned earlier, the emphasis on this was giving a chance to women all across the world, and TFYC has shown no indication of disqualifying trans women. They said the deadline was there to stop people who are a man who are saying they're trans when the contest pops up and denying women a spotlight, thus defeating the entire point. It is worth pointing out that despite the fact that the rules were made a solid month before Zoe and her friends started talking about this program, it is possible that the Google Doc was edited retroactively and we can't see it. However, TFYC's trans qualification remains consistent with the one listed in the document.
We are helping women to design video games. Women represent 45% of the video game market, but only direct 2% of video games, and we want to change that. Anyone who identifies as a woman has the option of proposing their idea to the Fine Young Capitalists,
which, once again, released a month before Zoe's involvement. Not that it did any good, because the negative traction this brought had caused the game jam to pretty much sink. And that's a hefty claim, I know, but the only game they managed to get out was Afterlife Empire by Danielle Mariano. And they just barely got that Indiegogo funded, which was done primarily by the 4chan board V. We'll be getting more into them later. But if your message is to be a game jam to show that there's an interest of having women staking their claim in the gaming industry, you'd think that there would be some form of coverage of it, especially in the 2014 environment, but any they have is few and far between and tied to the drama with Zoe Quinn rather than the product itself. It's gotten no real publication of the game, and if it wasn't for the retaliation of the 4chan board V, who backed the game in a large sum, it wouldn't have made it to the finish line. Yes, they did it out of spite, the obvious intention being to show 4chan was willing to assist the project, while people inside Zoe's circles were not. And demanding that TFYC doesn't take money from them would be synonymous to insisting the project sinks to appease people who had no interest in helping them, but one that brought this project to life and made what would be known as V's mascot, Vivian James. Yeah, I know, hey, that's the Gamergate girl. We'll get there when we get there. There was also a post made on Reddit by TFYC about Zoe's antics and how they can't get any attention in the media, and that Zoe doxed them while refusing to contact them. But despite all this, the game was made, and reception was by a few people who actually played it. It's not particularly good from what I've played and lacks polish. If you don't launch up the game just right, it won't cooperate. It seems to have aged poorly as the intro doesn't work like intended. The frame rate is consistently chugging, and I had an issue whenever I unlocked an ability. It was the only one I could use until I unlocked the next. I suspect 8 years with no form of update or maintenance that I know of probably wasn't kind to it, and there's probably some clumsy coding in there. Honestly, even if the game worked completely as intended today, it would just be passable in my opinion. Some will state that the simplistic design and technical shortcuts is part of the charm of a game jam, but that doesn't make it any better of a game. It may sound like Zoe screwed up what was a completely innocent and well-meaning project from what's going on here, but I would be a liar if I said that. At some point around August 27, 2014, Zoe got into contact with TFYC and they started to talk about the terms of a post apologizing about the whole debacle. And after their apology, Zoe would back it. Kinda weird to me off the bat that they have to apologize but Zoe doesn't, but alright. The issue was that part of this was leaked on Twitter by TFYC to appease someone who was hounding them. The post reveals that Zoe stating that although a doxing did take place, she wasn't the one who did it, as the person involved, one named Maya, doesn't work for her. In my opinion, this came off as petty, and not nearly as justified as someone else who we'll be talking about soon who dropped information on Zoe. Zoe came into this discussion expecting it to remain private, so you better have a damn good reason to breach that agreement. But honestly, this doesn't reveal anything damning. Zoe saying that I'm not the one that doxed you might be Zoe playing nice by not immediately stating that it wasn't a dox. What's much more contentious is Zoe's response. First off, it seems the emails actually occurred shortly after the Reddit post claiming Zoe did all this, despite the fact Zoe confronted them in February, when the project was in its infancy and hadn't even made its Indiegogo page. It took half a year for them to actually discuss this in private. Meanwhile, Zoe's Rebel Jam site has been up as early as April 25th, 2014, after the PepsiCo Jam incident, and also 2 months after her post towards TFYC, making it blatantly obvious Zoe only confronted them on this when they made a big enough stink about it, rather than when their project was on the risk of sinking because of the tweets Zoe and her friend made. And in this negotiation, as she calls it, Zoe insists that TFYC falsely tries to attribute blame for Matthew Rappard, the founder of TFYC, placing the blame of his docs towards Zoe when it was Maya who posted the information. And Zoe also states that the info is publicly available, but Zoe also takes great effort to distance from Maya in this, not at all bringing up the fact that Zoe expressed not only satisfaction in hurting TFYC's cause, while accusing it of being exploitative. I won't accept her saying this is an accident here because this is in the context of bragging that they weren't even trying, or that the post that they were looking for was for in search of a smart sounding woman, which TFYC clarifies that they specifically wanted someone who sounded intelligent to cover the opening video analysis of women in games. Zoe had shown she was more than happy to accept credit for the actions up until the point where it proves to be disadvantageous, in which she had responded in half-truths, stating that Maya was never under her employment when accused of working with her to smear TFYC. Zoe knows full well what people meant by this, but conveniently interprets the statement as was employed by, rather than had cooperated with, to make the statement appear untrue. And also an editor's note, TFYC did in fact say that Maya was a PR representative for Zoe, which I could find no information on that being the case. Maya is, however, a very experienced PR representative, and was also involved in multiple indie game conventions, and we know Maya's associated with Zoe Quinn, as she had it listed in her Patreon. Zoe was skirting around the truth with this falsehood, and trying to act like there was no connection between the two. TFYC was not doxed by Zoe or Maya. This was a public message, even confirmed by TFYC, but they did trail it back to Matthew Rappard, smeared the entire campaign, and then ignored it until it stopped being convenient to do so. Another in Zoe's long history of acting like the victim. But don't forget TFYC wasn't clean in all this. There's still more to cover. The founder, Matthew Rappard, who I suspect is the only member of the team with how he seems to represent them in every turn of the story, was actually an executive producer of Autobotica, and had been since 2013, before TFYC's founding. It becomes more clear that the Fine Young Capitalist is a sort of extension from Autobotica, and that they don't meet each other by chance in brief history, but that the story of TFYC working with Autobotica in the past and wanting to give more work to a South American company was at best a pretty up half-truth. I suspect that he was set up for the job because he was their only former representation outside of South America. Not only this, the profits made in the campaign don't actually go to charity. The wording is rather deceptive. The profits of the game go to charity, and presumably to Danielle, the woman who won the intended contest, along with the royalties to Autobotica. The money from the Indiegogo campaign went directly to TFYC and Autobotica for marketing, merchant development, I would assume. The backers weren't donating money, instead they were voting on where the profits of the charity donations go. From what I understand on how it played out, this is a straw poll from 4chan trying to decide where their cut of the charity would go, and then they sent their final decision to TFYC, and their decision was Colon Cancer Alliance, which they refer to as Chemo Butthurt. Well, nobody said 4chan was the model of maturity. The final divide is presented here, assuming the money was distributed the way they said on the chart, but I never found receipts on the profits donation lines, so who honestly knows if the profits actually went to charities. But even if someone posted a link to them following through with their word, the profits they made from Afterlife Empire was a drop in the bucket compared to the Indiegogo funding. However, I'm more than willing to say this wasn't a giant scam. They kept people constantly posted, advertised their work, showed off progress, and when they talk about the value of women in gaming, they cover it in such detail and effort, I can't possibly see this as a mere half-hearted cash grab. Afterlife Empire is not a particularly good game, but it is a completed game, and it's honestly not their fault word didn't get out about it. They've more than tried while making an enemy of someone who they couldn't have known had a lot of ties to the indie gaming news scene. I'm spoiling things. Seriously though, any indie gamers out there, have any of you ever heard of Afterlife Empire? Like I said, it's not a very good game, and anyone who tells you that a Game Jam game isn't meant to be a hyper-polished masterpiece, first off isn't acknowledging that they had more time, a bigger team, and more resources than your average Game Jam contestant, and how there are genuinely good Game Jam games out there. There was damage that Zoe had dealt, which she was completely willing to admit when it seemed cool at the time. Yet they did somehow show progress of their creation. They did in fact release the game as promised. You can make comments on how this doesn't actually get notice of the person who came up with the game's concept, but rather show Autobotica's capabilities. You can talk about how the pitch was misleading, and how sketchy it is that they don't admit TFYC is an extension of Autobotica. And you can criticize that most of the money that went into this entire project didn't go to charities. Although I think it goes without saying that doesn't make everything Zoe did okay. She had no idea that any of this was happening. She was just throwing out baseless accusations. But they did actually deliver on their promise. And I find the need to emphasize this because I want to make note of that when we get to an event later on in Zoe's history. I guess there's no more beating around the bush. Although this is an attempt of a chronological order, this saga occurs during an event that was certainly the peak of Zoe Quinn's relevancy. The event that's still referenced to this day all over the internet by people who don't actually know anything about it. It's time to actually start covering Zoe's part in Gamergate. This was kinda unavoidable. She was the catalyst for it after all. We're going to have to talk about Gamergate. And if you're familiar with this circle of the internet, you've probably heard the story a million times. But for the sake of context, it's important. And for God's sakes, look at these sources if you need to. Don't just take my word for it. Anyway, Gamergate kicked off as a movement against unethical journalism after Zoe Quinn's ex, Eron, dropped a long post about how she cheated on him with 5 guys, hence the 5 Guys Burgers and Fries memes you may have seen floating around at this time, and the occasional Greyhound bus. This unfortunately became a very team-oriented split for a lot of entertainers on the internet, as many were espousing whether they were for or against the movement. Those critical of it stating that it was a harassment campaign over a woman's alleged sex life being made public under the guise of a noble cause. The response led to several forms of media and games journalists reporting that harassment and sexism against many that were targeted, such as Zoe Quinn, Brianna Wu, Anita Sarkeesian, and Felicia Day, which were some of the big names. One thing that many remarked on involving the Zoe posts is how many of the names would have had positive potential effect on her career in indie gaming. Some people claim that the movement stated that Zoe Quinn had a positive review on Depression Quest from Nathan Grayson because they were dating, but this is a misinterpretation of what actually happened. And a response from Kotaku, a gaming news network they worked with at the time, stated that he had only posted one article on the site ever mentioning Zoe. This is a classic journo mislead. They don't lie, but disclose enough information to make you fill in the gaps the way they want. What they fail to bring up is that Nathan Grayson mentioned Depression Quest and Zoe Quinn in at least 2 other articles for Rock Paper Shotgun before Gamergate became a thing. And that Nathan Grayson was having sex with Zoe Quinn while she was in a relationship with Eron.
Oh, that's worse!
In one of those articles, Nathan tiles it a wordplay on Zoe's game Depression Quest, lists Depression Quest as one of the first greenlit games in the examples, somehow overshadowing Hand of Fate, and has Depression Quest as one of the tags for the article. This is far from someone he knew just in passing. But the escalation doesn't stop there. On August 19th, 2014, she insisted her Tumblr page was hacked, and from the looks of it, it was people from the 4chan board V, the video game board, saying that they had doxed her and were posting her nudes. But as a blog post by the user named The Spectacular Spider Girl had pointed out, Tumblr has a security feature to auto-log off people who are on the same account on different devices, meaning if anyone were doing this, it would have to be one person at a time. Now, this person could have been a member of V who was also being fed info and advice on how to sabotage Zoe's life. But if that were the case, why did they keep the blog name, blog theme, and not make any changes later on to try to make her blog deleted by the mods? And also the capitalization of V, which, hell, Even as someone who doesn't frequent 4chan, I know boards aren't capitalized. Why on earth would someone who's a 4chan regular defy old muscle memory and capitalize the V, thus titling it incorrectly? But going a bit backwards in the timeline, as I think this part is more important overall. Around August 16th, 2014, the aforementioned ex of Zoe, Eron, released a bunch of info on his dating experience with Zoe, and then how at one point they had a break between May and June, how she cheated on him with at least 5 guys. I don't have any source of her saying this, but according to Eron, she had talks about a trust system. And Zoe says that one lie compromises the entire structure of trust, as now you have to take everything they say with scrutiny. Very ironic with her deliberately leaving out the people she had slept with during that break, assuming she actually said this. 3 of the 5 guys that were listed and disclosed were Nathan Grayson, who you may remember as one of the people who had given Zoe a lot of positive exposure in the past. Nathan refers to Zoe as the founder of Dames Making Games, and the developer of It's Not Okay Cupid, a game she was working on with the help of a talented award-winning game developer Alec Holowka. But Zoe is treated as the sole creator, and the founder of Dames Making Games. I went through a few sources trying to find Zoe's inclusion on this project, but it seems that for all intents and purposes, Cicely Carver is the founder of it. Zoe's name seems to just be tagged on because she was a part of an initiative Cicely ran for indie gaming. Zoe's pretty much never mentioned again past this point, so these are at best inaccuracies created by wild exaggeration, or even potentially just Nathan taking Zoe's claims at face value. Either way, this is meant to puff up her reputation far more than she actually achieved, giving her positive exposure. And in the logs we can see that Eron states that Nathan had sex with Zoe knowing about her situation. Although Zoe omitted details, what they were we'll never actually know, but what we do know is that Zoe and Nathan talked plenty, and we have no reason to think he was unaware of that relationship unless Zoe kept that information hidden altogether. The second person on that list was her boss, and even worse, he was married. And when confronted on having to tell his wife about the matter, she advised against it because his wife might make it public. She assured Eron that it's because of the consequences it would have for women in gaming, but I doubt she was too worried about that before the point if she'd gotten to this position to begin with. The third person was Robin Arnott. Some of you may have heard Robin and Nathan's names, and it may have rung a bell. And that's because Robin Arnott was one of the people who corroborated the story of PepsiCo Game Jam. And Nathan Grayson reported on the events with the account from Zoe Quinn, Robin Arnott, Jared Rosen, and Audrey Wallach. In Zoe's reflection on the events, she was not legally allowed to talk about most of it, so she kept it vague. She mentioned being in the apartment of the only reporter on the scene and longtime friend, who we can conclude was Jared. Meaning of all the main voices that the majority of the news outlets have based their accountings of the PepsiCo Game Jam on, only one of them wasn't directly tied to Zoe. And Audrey's testimony doesn't mention any of Zoe's actions during the Game Jam, other than that she left alongside her, which probably puts into context the skepticism I expressed earlier. But back onto Robin. Robin was one of the people Zoe was having an affair with, who she had been messaging even after Eron confronted her and told her that she had to be completely honest with him from this point forward and not contact any people she cheated on him with. According to Eron, she had deleted the messages to hide them, but Eron caught her messaging him on Facebook, and also noticed her relationship status was only visible to select people, none of which were the people she cheated on him with. Unfortunately, we only have Eron's word on this part, but they all seem to be connected in this indie gaming clique and covering one another. The Zoe post only reinforces that there was, in fact, a connection there between journalists and select game devs. You may be thinking that this all sounds conspiratorial, I don't blame you. Even with these documents, as one of the skeptics in the archives have pointed out, that message can be faked. The person even took the liberty of demonstrating so. But if you look carefully at the edited document, even though the font matches, it doesn't match up properly with the second message. The I in the previous post was only a single pixel ahead of the W's edge. This one is 2 pixels ahead, revealing an inconsistency. If you also check the text, you can tell where the white box was put over the original text with it being pure white. The screen caps have noise to them. See that mild static over there? That's noise. If you see here where that slight difference is made, you can see it is consistently white across the area and inconsistent with the rest of the image. Between the text is a very clean set of letters, not matching the screenshot and depicting something that was made and saved in post of a screen cap. If we demonstrate the same thing with Eron's words, you get plenty of that expected noise, as well as a mild discoloration on the edge of the text. Notice the yellows and blues. This gives the image more authenticity of being a screen cap. If you do this test with the documents on Zoe's post, you'll find plenty around the text. Even the highlighted ones have discoloration and noise, so either these are genuine, or Eron is a better liar than Zoe. I know it sounds like off-brand Nerd City with this Photoshop observation, but also take into account that Eron responded to the skepticism, and we actually have a video of him pulling up one of the messages from when they were still talking on Facebook.
The attorney claims this is fake. I am going to carry out a search on my Facebook profile for Zoe's name. There it is. And if I click it, you see the URL change to her old username. And let me carry out a search for once during Game Jam. So the search messages, and Zoe's comes up. I'll look through it. And here we have the messages that might be in question. So there it is. I don't know what more proof you could possibly want.
After this entire thing was posted, this did in fact make a lot of drama occur in the gaming industry. So Zoe vented her frustrations on Twitter about how she repeatedly wanted to talk to him about this in person, obviously to try to avoid this going public. Mind you, Zoe is a liar, and I suspect she faked her own doxing as mentioned earlier, but I would be more surprised if there weren't incidents of harassment because it is the internet, and I can't help but feel Eron didn't do this out of a journalistic obligation, but because Zoe burned him repeatedly, and this was, while intricate, out of spite. But he does list the reason for doing this outside that motivation. And it's that reason that people see this as more than petty online drama. And that's the implications that this has for how much influence these cliques had over indie gaming circles. This information shows that Zoe had her boss, a gaming journalist, and a composer in her pocket. There was a long branching field of nepotism that could be trailed back to Zoe. And despite the harassment that's brought about to Zoe, Eron isn't liable for the things that other people do, especially if he never even so much as insinuates it should happen. The entire purpose of this was to smear her reputation, yes, but it wasn't to send people to harm her as she insisted. In fact, Eron openly disavows harassment of Zoe and her friends in the edit of the primer of the page, and further thanks people for stopping. He also takes lengths to avoid commenting on Zoe's docs when it came to light because he knew confirming or denying it would only give info for anyone who potentially wanted to weaponize said information. To argue that his intent was to have his ex harassed with how much he tried to communicate with her up to this point is attributing intent that wasn't there and placing the actions of other people onto him instead of the people who were directly responsible. Zoe then proceeds to try to suppress anyone talking about it, like this DMCA she sent to take down a video by Monday Mad, which to me shows that Zoe doesn't understand the Streisand effect. She also files a restraining order. Yeah, that's right, this entire saga's got legal documents. The sources are gonna be helpful, and it just keeps getting worse. Because this isn't just any restraining order, and to help translate, I was pointed in a direction of a fellow named Egg. If you're still alive out there somewhere, thank you, Egg. Your work has been incredibly helpful and timeless. The affidavit in question was one of abuse. Now, I know what you're thinking. Zoe would have filled out a form of mental and or psychological abuse for having a large segment of the internet targeted towards you. Well, we're working under the legal definition under this law, and Massachusetts law has a specific set of guidelines for the definition of abuse, which are listed as A. Attempting to cause or causing physical harm. B. Placing another in fear of imminent physical harm. C. Causing another to engage involuntarily in sexual relations by force, threat, or duress. The definitions in this legality are specifically made for physical and sexual abuse. So what? Are people who live in Massachusetts getting off scot-free when they abuse their significant other emotionally and psychologically but never lift a finger? No. That's just a different restraining order, a 258E, which may make people wonder why'd she use one intended for physical harm when the overwhelming majority of her complaints are online. Well, this is where it starts to get interesting, and a bit off track, so I'll have to give you the nutshell of it. What likely colored the restraining order decision was a previous case in the state, Nilan v. Valenti. Meredith Nilan had allegedly ran over a pedestrian in a car accident, bringing about serious injuries, and had left the scene of the crime. She was charged with negligent operation of a motor vehicle, but claimed she stopped and looked around, but left the scene of the accident. It was settled that there was insufficient evidence for the case to go to trial. Well, a fellow named Dan Valenti caught wind of this, and started blogging about it on his news website. He suspected that Nilan got special treatment because her father was the chief of probation at Berkshire Superior Court. A month after the case was closed, it was overruled, and in the case, the prosecutor dismissed the charge of leaving the scene, and she was charged 6 months for misdemeanor negligent operation. Valenti was blogging of the entire ordeal as this went on. About 4 months later, Nilan filed a restraining order and claimed Valenti's posts were lies and innuendos, that they were a regular and malicious attack on her reputation, and she feared for her safety as his tirades might bring about vigilante justice. This might sound vaguely familiar. Once this was filed, Valenti removed the post on his blog, but he also filed a responsive affidavit, stating that he did not harass her or encourage outrage. When they went to court, he argued that the state's law doesn't authorize the court to prescribe or censor speech on the internet to this degree, citing another case where the Supreme Judicial Court limits its reach to fighting words and/or true threats. Fighting words. Words that are likely to provoke a fight, face-to-face personal insults that are so personally abusive that they are plainly likely to provoke a violent reaction and cause a breach of peace. True threats. The speaker means to communicate a serious expression of an intent to commit an act of unlawful violence to a particular individual or group of individuals. The speaker need not actually intend to carry out the threat. Rather, a prohibition on true threats protects the individual from the fear of violence and from the disruption that fear engenders, in addition to protecting people from the possibility that the threat of violence will occur. Valenti argues there was no face-to-face confrontation likely to provoke violence, ruling out the fighting words clause, or any communicated intent to carry out an act of unlawful violence, although true threats are more vague. Valenti argued on account of Nilan's previous judge letting her off easy as an unconstitutional action that he was speaking out against by reporting it on his blog, and to restrain that reporting would be outright unconstitutional. Nilan did not file a response, meaning Valenti pretty much won, although the judge said he was walking a very, very thin line. So what the hell does this have to do with Zoe's case? Well, the first thing, that this was done under Massachusetts law, and that the Nilan v. Valenti case was filed under a 258E restraining order, which fits more appropriately with what Zoe wanted. However, filing it under a 209A, which she did, means that there's a better chance that people in Massachusetts won't bring up the similarities as it's under a different prevention order. This was pretty much a way of skirting this entire case from being another Nilan gag order, and thus being dismissed. But let's see what Zoe actually had to say in her affidavit. On or about August 16, 2014, the defendant wrote and published a long post about my sex life and private dealings to several websites that he knew had a history of harassing me. He was aware that harassment and stalking would happen, and openly admits to doing so to damage my professional reputation as an independent artist. Since then, I received numerous death and rape threats from an anonymous mob that he had given details to. My info, like my home address, phone number, email, passwords, and those of my family have been widely distributed alongside nude photos of me, and several of my professional accounts and those of my colleagues have been hacked. Eron has coached this mob multiple times, made multiple social media accounts to smear my name publicly, and had stoked the fire of this in many occasions and doesn't seem to be stopping. He has also called hotels that he suspected me of staying at, falsifying information to give more personal info to the mob. I'm in fear of him as he is not repentant of his mob's harassment of me and keeps hinting at giving them more information, which he knows will continue inciting threats and harassment. He was also violent during our last sexual encounter in July, prior to breaking up, leaving several bruises on my arm. My friend stayed with me in the hotel Eron and I had shared after this. Having seen the bruises on my arm and noticing he still had a hotel key because we feared he would come back. Eron also admitted mental instability to me and informed me via email that he has a history of being violent with a family member. For these reasons, I asked that he be ordered to stay away from me, not contact me, and stop providing any information about me to those involved in an ongoing harassment and stalking campaign against me, and stop contacting friends and professional colleagues to try to destroy my business. I have several hundred pages of evidence if needed. I'm gonna go over this with Egg's post on the matter. I'd recommend looking at his work if you have the time. He does go over the legal parts better than I could, and I don't want to just repeat what he says. I am currently resisting the urge to use a dumb Ace Attorney cross-examination format. She starts by stating, the defendant wrote and published a long post about my sex life and private dealings, which is true, but without context implies he shared things in great personal detail to make her look bad, when in reality, he showed the Facebook logs of her admitting she had sex while they were on break and had been lying. The Zoe post's intent is to make it evident that Zoe's a dishonest person. It's to reveal her nature, not that she had lots of sex. That's just the outlet that information was provided. But let's continue on. Several websites that he knew had a history of harassing me. There is no evidence to support this. Eron has stated on his Tumblr he posted them on Penny Arcade and Something Awful. 4chan picked it up later with screenshots. He chose those two forums because he knew they liked her. It was deliberately done in hopes of softening the blow, which seems accurate because when someone on Something Awful informed Zoe, the post was nuked out of orbit, and the person likely had to recount it to her via summary before ever seeing it for herself. Hence why he eventually made a WordPress on the matter. He was aware that harassment and stalking would happen? Yes, which is why he took great measures of reducing it instead of hip-firing the info to every site that would take it like you insinuated. And openly admits to doing so to damage my professional reputation as an independent artist. Well, that was a very generous interpretation of its effects on your career. Bad things you do shouldn't be suppressed because it would harm your reputation. Since then, I received numerous death and rape threats from an anonymous mob that he had given details to. This shouldn't even have to be explained. We should legally punish Eron for the actions of an indescript amount of complete strangers out of these threats. Do you expect us to proxy thought police? Refer to Nilan v. Valenti. You're going to need malicious intent in his words, but you can't find them, which is why you're trying to use this instead. Since then, I received numerous death and rape threats from an anonymous mob that he had given details to. You see what she's doing here too, don't you? She says that he had given details to them to prime for the rest of her personal information being presented online, as if he gave them this info. The thing is, his post doesn't release any of this information. In fact, Eron refused to confirm or deny that Zoe's dox was real, and explained why he would find it unethical to do so. Summarized as basically saying, if I confirm or deny that's Zoe's real personal information, it would just put her in more danger. Alongside nude photos of me. Once again, Zoe's trying to use misleading wording to insinuate Eron had posted her nudes online as a form of revenge. This is actually my favorite part, because I not only have access to the Reddit post of Eron stating that he only knew about pictures like that of Zoe from her saying that they were on a website that's long gone. No, I'm not even gonna touch the suspected history on that. I've looked into it very little, and we haven't even gotten to the Kickstarter scam. But I also have a Twitter post of her claiming that an ex under a pseudonym posted them on 4chan. When Eron got upset that he presumed she meant him, she said that she had multiple exes. I see. And you didn't think to specify in the affidavit it's not Eron if you didn't think it was him. And said ex is only brought up just now. And you immediately change the subject when pressed on it and never bring it up again. And yet here you are trying to make a connection of revenge porn back to Eron. I'm tired of being around the bush. Zoe lied. And several of my professional accounts and those of my colleagues have been hacked. Eron should become a superhero if he's able to get people to hack the accounts of your colleagues simply because they're associated with you. Once again, Zoe's pinning responsibility on Eron for someone else's actions, assuming they even happened. Eron has coached this mob multiple times. Okay, pause again. What she's referring to as coaching was this post here, where Eron, while speaking to 4chan members, was stating that it takes one bad example to paint the group. Pretty much explained that he is hesitant to give information because he knows it will likely be misused or weaponized by someone even if the majority knows better. Made multiple social media accounts to smear my name publicly. Maybe it's because it was a different time, but I can't help but wonder who on earth doesn't have alt accounts. This is treated as insidious, but there's nothing inherently damning about that. It's also really vague. Does the multiple accounts refer to the same social media site, or multiple sites? Because the wording permits either. Zoe might not even be talking about alt accounts at all. From how it's painted, it sounds like Eron was banned multiple times, but just kept coming back with info to harass Zoe, which isn't the case. For God's sakes, you could still find their old tweets as of recording without an archive. It had stoked the fire of this in many occasions and doesn't seem to be stopping. Here's yet more indication that Eron went out of his way to avoid doing so. I'm in fear of him as he is not repentant of his mob's harassment of me and keeps hinting at giving them more information. More of your personal information or more clarification on what he presented? Because it seems he's been taking great lengths to avoid giving them any more ammunition. Which he knows will continue inciting threats and harassment. Then why doesn't he? If he's so malicious towards you and only wants to tarnish your reputation, and is unrepentant of the harassment you face as you have stated earlier, why would he, when having access to hidden information, as Zoe claims he does, not put it out there? He's not trying to blackmail Zoe. There's nothing to gain doing this. Also, have you noticed that Zoe's going in repetitive circles to try to fill out this affidavit and convince people that Eron did this to incite a mob to attack her? He was also violent during our last sexual encounter in July, prior to breaking up, leaving several bruises on my arm. My friend stayed with me in the hotel Eron and I had shared after this. Having seen the bruises on my arm and noticing he still had a hotel key because we feared he would come back. Which is not only the one part of this affidavit that's actually relevant to the protection order, Zoe's also claiming this at the end of this affidavit, and her only evidence is an eyewitness account of a friend. Once again, eyewitness accounts being one of the most useless forms of evidence there is, and that account is somebody who has a motive to lie about it. Eron also admitted mental instability to me. Okay, but does he actually have any instabilities, and do you have any evidence of this? Also, attributing negative qualities onto someone because of a mental illness you chose conveniently not to specify seems like an odd outlook of mental illness for someone who focuses on the understanding of depression. Irrelevant, I know, but I want to point this out before a pattern occurs. But yes, Zoe would have evidence for this, but the mental illness Eron mentioned was likely schizoid personality disorder, which means he has trouble expressing his emotions. It's not known for making people violent. And informed me via email that he has a history of being violent with a family member. A hefty claim only for it to be summarized by one of the people at the hearing. Ben Hidoff stated that the email of his violent history was that he tackled his grandfather once when he was 8 and his grandfather hit his head on the cabinet. Philip White has backed up that the email was in fact what Ben had said. So it's Zoe's word against the person at the hearing and another who claims that they have seen the email as well. Far from concrete proof that Zoe's lying in of itself. But Zoe has shown she will conflate anything to try and make Eron look bad, and if it was something that damning, she wouldn't be so vague when the burden of proof was in her field, especially since this bit of evidence would be trying to prove that Eron has a violent nature, which is much more suitable for this protection order. And judging from the outcome of this case, I'm more inclined to believe Ben's response. For these reasons, I ask that he be ordered to stay away from me, not contact me, and stop providing any information about me to those involved in an ongoing harassment and stalking campaign against me, and stop contacting friends and professional colleagues to try to destroy my business. Once again, putting in a malicious spin doesn't make that thing so. She was attributing these things to him without showing that's the case, not to mention the archived screen caps of her privately messaging people in her clique to not engage with anything Eron does, and that he's a crazy ex who only wants to hurt her. Which now that contradicts the claim so far, but then she states that he showed up at her apartment at 2 AM and has sent death threats from his IP address. Yet none of this far more damning evidence is visible in her affidavit. How come she brings up his mental illness vaguely, and anything we can find on it ascribes qualities that conflict with his supposed behavior during their relationship? Nothing in the writing adds up. The prioritization of the subjects, the choice in which to document it, how she points the blame, none of it. Zoe has shown time and time again she is willing to lie under oath, and despite the mentioning of having several hundred pages of evidence, she wasn't able to nail him on anything like shadowing hotels he suspected she went to for some reason, or stalking her where she supposedly traced a death threat back to him. So it's no surprise to me that Zoe's case went under. Eron was off the hook. He tried to flip it around on Zoe, but unfortunately nothing came of it. But take that in. Might be bittersweet, but I want you to really enjoy the moment if you can. It's pretty much the happiest ending we're gonna get in any of these stories. Now let's talk about the Kickstarter saga. Kickstarted in the butt, which for the sake of both of our sandies I'll be calling Project Tingler from now on, was Zoe's Kickstarter project she had done alongside Chuck Tingle. And if you're not familiar with Chuck Tingle's work, his entire gimmick was these self-published homoerotic stories of the protagonist having sex with living inanimate objects, like the British Pound and the fidget spinner. It's pretty obviously a comedy through absurdity, and forgive me for deciding not to research this aspect too much, but Chuck Tingle is obviously a pseudonym. And listening to someone read one of the stories can be funny, but if you've read one, you've read them all, and more of the comedy value comes from the cover art and title. The project asked for a little more than Afterlife Empire, its goal being $69,420, which, for the sake of things, I'm just going to assume that they wanted $70,000, but they figured they would do it funny, and it ended up being funded over $85,000. From what I could gather that wasn't hidden behind a backers page, Project Tingler was meant to be a visual novel that was animated by models on green screens depicting the movements of the characters. Meaning that honestly, Zoe's animation was the easy part. Hey, how's it going? Self-taught amateur editor here. The models being fully dressed up and making the motions for the visual novel means that Zoe does not need to do any art or animation. The editing magic pretty much comes down to chroma keying the animation and positioning it where needed. The closest thing Zoe ends up doing here that seems like a creative liberty in the regard of editing the assets was that the pirate Sasquatch was made translucent to indicate that he's in the protagonist's mind, which also is literally just a slider on the Sony Vegas timeline. And just in case, for anyone who's still impressed by any of this, this isn't to say green screening is a lazy style.
I don't see why this is a problem. No, I don't see that at all because, check it out. BAM!
No doubt Zoe still had to at least direct the actors to get these shots, and seems to have had a part in costume design, which seems to be just a bunch of props randomly meshed together, straight out of a Spirit Halloween store. point is, what directing and costume design is there, she was part of. But notice how all these characters are in place. Sure, they're moving around, but they're all in an idle loop, but not actually really doing much. Green screen as a medium is well known for its creative freedom and absurdity, and has been well explored years before Zoe even got her hands on it. The thing about green screens is getting someone inside a whole new background and environment is actually the easy part. The difficult part is finding ways to have them apply well, having them move around on the screen and sometimes even follow the motions of the camera or to fake movements when they pretend to move. All of these are small things that can go a long way to add to the experience. Even taking the measure to try to get their lighting to better match the background photo, which as you can see, Zoe had not taken the time to do so. Yes, this is literally a homoerotic visual novel, made in the universe where a man came out after having sex with a British pound. But acknowledging something is stupid doesn't immediately forgo putting in effort, especially if tens of thousands of dollars are invested into said stupid thing. But it seems that investment won't be paying off anytime soon, because the last time the Kickstarter was updated as of the time of recording was 2018. Zoe has been radio silent about it since, from what I can find, despite her being involved in several other projects. There's not a lot on this story compared to the others, honestly. It's pretty cut and dry terrible, but no doubt isn't even the worst thing she's done on this listing. But before we get to that, I'm finally going back to talking about Alec and setting the stage proper. It's not lost to me the irony that although Alec has more achievements under his belt than Zoe, his part is far shorter in summary, but that fact is part of the very nature of why I find it necessary to cover this to begin with. Even when he was starting out, it seemed Alec had a calling for being a composer in gaming, being the one behind the music of I'm Okay, a Murder Simulator, and if it seems a poor taste, that was the point. This game was made by a small group of indie devs in response to Jack Thompson's, yes, we're going that far back, open letter that if any game developer made a game which a grieving father who lost his son to someone influenced by video games takes vengeance on the industry in a killing spree, he'd spend $10,000 on a charity of Take-Two's choice. This was a deliberately edgy response meeting those requirements, although Jack Thompson's letter was never serious, hence why it was named a modest video game proposal, in reference to the satirical letter A Modest Proposal. I think the smart move would have been to point out that it was satire but be a good sport and donate anyway. Fortunately, although Jack Thompson refused to pay, Penny Arcade still donated to the charity in his name as an act of spite, so something still came out of this. Well, two things did actually. In the conclusion of this irony off with Jack Thompson, Alec told the lead designer of the game, Derek Yu, about a project of his own that he had in the works, and he wanted in. So the two made BitBlot to make his project fully realized under the title Aquaria. The game ended up winning the grand prize in the Indie Game Festival Awards of 2007, and after that, Alec kinda got in the groove of things. Even though he had little actual experience under his belt at the time, he felt a lot more competent after his work on Aquaria, and he used that momentum to be a musician in multiple other small indie games. Another which, titled Crayon Physics Selects, ended up being another grand prize winner for the IGF, only 2 years after Aquaria. He was also the musician of Offspring Fling and Towerfall Ascension. Not award winners, mind you, but I certainly find it noteworthy as titles, especially since Towerfall is one of Maddie Torsen's projects. The lead developer is Celeste, as many of you would recognize. Before we get out of the 2012 part of Alec's life, I should mention the brief swing he had with Zoe Quinn. I'm not going to be going over the details you think I am though. Not yet. To put it briefly, the soonest I could find Zoe mentioning Alec was April 16th, 2012. No confirmation that they were dating, but that was pretty much confirmed on the 25th due to the Indie Function podcast. And at some point shortly after, they must have broken up because Eron Joni threw out the Zoe post on August 2014. My guess is somewhere in the middle of May 2012 because that's where the saga I'll be bringing up later seems to end. But let's not get too far off track. After his work as a musician for Towerfall in 2013, he wasn't very active in the game development scene for some time. But that was because Alec eventually was involved in a partner project that expanded into a Kickstarter for what would easily be the game that he would be most remembered for. Night in the Woods is pretty high up there in the realm of indie games that stick out in my memory in a positive way. It's a game set in the autumn of a dying town called Possum Springs. You play a college dropout named Mae Borowski who goes back to her hometown and lives with her parents. On revisiting the town, the player can notice the decay. There's constant indication of structural decline, local businesses shutting down overshadowed by more convenient options or places with greater relevance, often a further drive from home and giving less incentive for the youth to remain. And Mae, on reuniting with her friends, learns that although they're going through their own hardships, they're tackling personal responsibilities and or making steps to move forward in their own lives. Things Mae does not do. The town, Mae, and I'd even argue the choice of season tie together very well to the narrative that is the stagnation of what was as life passes by those who attempt to restore it or act as if it's not happening. And to compound on the nuances of the character writing, these friends carry personal burdens that make their actions and motivations worth reflecting on. Like how May's childhood friend B's personal behavior may have something to do with basically living the inverse life of May, where she was essentially stripped of any opportunity or freedom at a young age. Or how Angus's vice from his abuse is to cook because his mother would sometimes not feed him. May in the end comes to terms with what she's going to lose and how much it's going to hurt, but honestly hopes that it does, because that means that it was worth something, and although she lives in the moment, she does so without the delusion of permanence. The game's simple but memorable aesthetic is complemented by the fantastic visual effects, which is only further emphasized by a soundtrack that gives a dreary day-to-day life of exploring the town to find what little interesting there is, while not actually being boring to experience. There's a lot more to talk about involving the game in general, but this isn't a review, and I think this was an alright summary for the things that drew in a cult following it maintains today. Although I will be lynched for not bringing up Greg. Alec Holowka was a co-designer with this game with Scott Benson and Bethany Hockenberry, making the development team Infinite Fall. They made the pitch of Night in the Woods on Kickstarter and they are funded by the second day. They hit over 400% of their funding at the end of the campaign. The original asking goal was $50,000. Being a publisher with Finji, the game was intended to be released at some point in 2015, but due to complications ended up releasing early 2017, which honestly, not great, but I've heard far worse delays. The game not only had a great Kickstarter, but took the indie gaming scene by storm. In 2017, it was nominated for 7 awards. SXSW's Gamer's Voice Single Player Award, Golden Joystick's Best Storytelling, Best Indie Game, and Breakthrough Award, the Games Award Game for Impact, and Best Independent Game Award, as well as Titanium's Best Indie Game Award, which is a lot of nominations but no actual awards. But in 2018, I suspect is when the game started to get more traction after its Weird Autumn update. National Academy of Video Game Trade Reviewers Writing in a Comedy Award, SXSW's Most Fulfilling Community-Funded Game Award, IGF's Excellence in Narrative as well as Grand Prize Award, and the Narrative Award for the 14th British Game Academy Awards. These weren't nominations, they actually won these in 2018. The game became a booming success and very well known in a lot of indie gaming circles, and to this day it carries significance and traction to many. Hell, as of the time of writing this, they were selling their collector's edition for the physical copies of the game. And although you may have noticed the game was heavily complimented on its narrative and occasionally on its aesthetic, none bring up the soundtrack, which I think is a crime, because this game would not have the impact it does without the soundtrack it has behind it. And not to forget the sheer quantity it has with its quality. Even when I'm working on the audio, even when I worked on the script I'm reading right now, and I'm only like 2/3 of the way through at this point, without even checking the final results of my audio, if I wanted to, I could use the OST as background music for the entire video without using a single song twice. The music I've been using in the background this whole time almost entirely consisted of his work. According to credits, Scott was behind the writing, along with Bethany, as well as the art and animation. And don't get me wrong, I think the game is well written. There's writing in here that perfectly indicates the nature of people saying hostile things towards each other as in-jokes as friends. But Alec was in charge of the music and the coding, which might sound less, but I can't express how much you miss a well-made soundtrack when you realize the game doesn't have enough songs, or has them poorly placed. That and the coding is the very skeletal structure of a video game. We'll learn more about Alec behind the scenes once this goes further, but you may have noticed in the timeline we're getting dangerously close to the incident. So I want you to pause if you need to, grab a snack, get comfortable, because this part will be anything but. I have a ridiculous amount of qualms with her first post on the matter, which should be the strongest steps forward considering just how major her accusations are, but before I turn to it, I want to go over it and give you a summary of her recounting of things. August 26, 2019, Zoe Quinn comes out with a post on Twitter. A few months into making games, she was raped by an unnamed assailant who threatened to compromise her visa if she spoke out. Alec Holowka talked about her going to Winnipeg to visit him, taking advantage of her vulnerability. She bought a plane ticket there, and Alec agreed to buy the plane ticket back. And her roommate had to use his miles to get her out of the apartment that she was physically confined into by him. While she was in Winnipeg, he isolated her from her social ties and was abusive when they were alone, and having him program a game she was working on instead of a friend that she was working with. He made sure she was incapable of properly leaving without him. He was violent during sex and manipulating her into thinking he's the only person that loves her. She spent a large amount of time hiding from him in the bathroom and trying to avoid his mood swings. When she got help getting out with a friend, Alec could barely look at her. She sent a breakup email once home, and he banned her from any gaming community he ran, and then tried to get the people in the industry to assist in his suicide, making it a scene ensuring she was blacklisted from any events. When Gamergate took place and Zoe first vaguely mentioned an ex making the Zoe post, 2 other women asked if it was Alec because he had done similar things to them. She proceeds to talk about how terrified she is to speak up because she still fears Alec, and doesn't want to go in any events and risk of seeing him or seeing him applauded by people, especially those who knew. You might be getting a bit of deja vu. Clearly Zoe took notes from her ex who made the Zoe post when making this. The difference being Eron did this immediately after the breakup, and provided piles on piles of evidence for what he had to say. Zoe decided to publish this self-admittedly 8 years later, after being inspired by Natalie Lawhead's post alleging that she was sexually assaulted by a composer for Skyrim, Jeremy Soule. So she had dug up this personal case of hers nearly a decade prior at the time, provides no evidence in the past, any personal messages or any receipts that would indicate any of this to be true, and openly admits she did it because someone else called out a big game dev and thought she could do the same now that someone else had. But despite all of this, her thread is fled by people accepting this at face value. News articles posting about it shortly after and adding little to no further insight onto the case other than Zoe at this point using they-them pronouns. This is why you gotta do your own research for stuff like this. But of all the people who could and did believe Zoe's story immediately, there was one who was the worst possible person to do so. But before we really get onto him, I want to stick onto Zoe's case for a little longer, and really dissect the post and explain why they probably didn't dig up any evidence they could have had. Like, for example, why didn't Zoe bring up the toxic ex when they were in the spotlight during and after Gamergate? After all, this all took place after the Alec relationship, and I won't accept that they wanted to avoid garnering any attention. Zoe had a book on Gamergate, and a crisis hotline sharing the same name specifically meant for those dealing with online abuse. They had no issue with being a figurehead against harassment, and yet with this level of notoriety to this point where Zoe was a more recognizable name than Alec at the time, they strangely had nothing to say about the matter. While we're on the subject of Zoe's judgment and character according to their stories, how come they were sexually assaulted a month prior by someone who threatened their visa if they spoke out, and just let it go after they showed how sorry they are? Yet Alec is getting thrown under the bus without any indication that they tried to contact him again at any point recently before this. And yet Zoe, after a traumatic life-threatening event like this, was also completely willing to trust Alec to the point of leaving their home and living with him while also being completely dependent on someone else being your means of going back. Why the hell would you be this trusting to anyone at this point? Why would Zoe agree on paying for the ticket there and having the other person pay for the ticket back when you know you're not staying there rather than the other way around? Surely it'd be safer for you to secure the money to return for yourself once you make it there. But let's not get too off track. There's far more holes in this allegation to go over. Zoe in her writing makes claims about being isolated by Alec from her friends, a typical abuse tactic to try to convince victims that their partner is all they have. Well, it turned out they weren't so isolated, because on May 24th, a bit before they got there from my understanding, they were orchestrating a meetup in Winnipeg called Windypeg, which had somewhere in the ballpark of 40 people intended to arrive. We don't have a lot of info on the actual event and how many people actually showed up, but there were a lot of indie game devs coming together to hang out there, allowing Zoe to make ties despite Alec's isolating nature according to Zoe. And for anyone who wants to dismiss this because Zoe came up with this idea before they went to Winnipeg, so Alec couldn't control it, how come Alec didn't try to get it cancelled, try to isolate Zoe, interfere with Zoe hanging out with anybody? In fact, Zoe never brings this party up. If any of this stuff happened, this would be a good example of it. They also went off to get fabric to make plushies, namely the Offspring Fling protagonist, which, yes, was a project Alec had made a soundtrack for. So there is the possibility he okayed it and followed them there to get the supplies, but Zoe had tweeted their work multiple times with no indication that Alec was around, and this is never brought up in the retelling of the story. Also, I do feel the need to note that Zoe did actually make these. Yeah, I didn't believe it either, but they were actually used in the trailer made by Kurt Gardner, who confirms that Zoe did in fact make these. All of these seem odd, but people could probably make arguments that they aren't necessarily damning. But what really tears a hole through this story is when Zoe mentions heading to Montreal, and if anybody would be up for hanging out for 5 hours on the 4th of May. This Twitter post was made 10 days prior to actually heading to Montreal. No mentions of being there with a friend on the post, and Zoe safely arrived exactly as expected. Surely if Alec was trying to be controlling, as mentioned earlier, and trying to stop them from leaving, he would monitor Zoe's Twitter. This wouldn't have gotten through. How would Zoe get the time to safely plan this publicly while sharing a home with an abusive partner over a week in advance? The simple reality of it is that Zoe was not being held captive. They made this accusation, the burden of proof lies on them, and yet Zoe arrives with none. Meanwhile, double-checking their incredibly vague testimony has only gained sources that contradict their claims. I also don't feel willing to give Zoe the benefit of the doubt, not only because all of these claims listed prior, but because Zoe has a history of conflating actions towards their exes as seen in the affidavit. You know, the other time they said their ex had assaulted them and they were saved from said toxic relationship by a friend. But that, unfortunately, didn't matter when it came to the consequences of this allegation. As a team, Infinite Fall by the next week came to the decision to cut ties with Alec, a decision approved by the publisher as well. They say it like it was a difficult decision, but anyone who doesn't remember Infinite Fall's team, it consisted of 3 members: Alec Holowka, Scott Benson, and Bethany Hockenberry. So one only had to convince the other that this was the best course of action, which I bet was relatively easy considering they'd been married for over a decade, and they made the call in the span of about 3 days. It probably also helps that they were not on good terms with Alec even before this, according to Scott, but we'll get into that in a bit. Alec being booted off of Infinite Fall, the widespread articles of the allegation, and the very nature of said allegation, along with them coming from someone who had many ties in the indie gaming industry, effectively meant that Alec had no future in the business from this point forward. He must have realized that as well, because on the 31st of August, his sister, Aline Holowka, had informed people on Twitter that Alec had committed suicide. It doesn't explicitly say suicide, but this was reported 5 days after this all went down. 4 days after his entire career came crumbling, and it's heavily alluded to with how she talks about his mental illness. It's to the point where if it wasn't suicide, she would have had to specify that suicide wasn't the cause of death. This was so carefully worded as to not sound too sympathetic towards Alec, and to not be used as ammunition to start more feuds. But the responses on this turn of events I'm focusing on are that Zoe had temporarily closed their account on Twitter on September 4th, and then opened it back up on the 12th, and posted their response, which I'll be looking into, as well as advertised their year of release villain for DC Comics. Scott also made a response about it a week after, and oh boy. I can't say it gets worse on the account that Alec can't die twice, but the story certainly doesn't get any less frustrating. So I'm going to go ahead and dissect it, and remember, though I will keep bringing it up, to take this with a grain of salt, because we're working off of what Scott had to say, but Alec can't because he's gone. Scott was working on this before Alec took his own life, but this comment was still made after the allegations came public. And what comes is a large post after Alec's suicide of how awful he was to be around, alluding that Alec gave him PTSD and had driven him into therapy. So let's read more to figure out what Alec had done, according to Scott, to bring this about. Scott recounts that in 2013 he was just another struggling freelance animator and artist. Alec had spotted him through Twitter and got into contact. According to Scott, Alec had approached him hoping that this project they could work on together would get him out of a rut. He let Scott do the spitballing for the concept he wanted to do, and he really liked the concept of Night in the Woods, and trusted Scott with a lot of the creative freedom on the project, and created a tool set for Scott to use while working on the game, while also showing him the ropes on creating a game on a technical level. He talks about how he's a 32-year-old artist struggling to make a living since he was 18, while Alec was 29 and a wealthy game developer with a glowing track record, which I mean, yeah. But he also talks about Alec's hyper-personality at the time and how he was taking medication for a mood disorder, likely one of the things Aline was referring to in Alec's announcement. But it's hard to discern what it really is off of other people's accountings with how vague they are. But Scott also mentions that he too takes medication for his mood, in a way that alludes he could empathize with that. Alec then suggested they make a prototype within 6 months. Scott said that was impractical as he can't take 6 months off of client work, and so Alec suggested that they make a Kickstarter. My assumption is Alec concluded that they can't commit to making a game if they can't take long periods of time to develop it. Scott agreed to it, assuming nothing would come out of it. Well, he had a rude awakening when it ended up getting funded almost immediately. Without much warning, I wasn't a freelance animator anymore. I was a full-time game developer with a legal requirement to deliver a game with someone I barely knew. Yes, Scott, you consented to all these risks and ended up wildly successful for it. You have to forgive me if I'm not feeling a ton of sympathy for the compromising scenario you find yourself in, and had also opted into knowing what would happen if it had went through. You're an adult. After the Kickstarter funding, they put together a proof of concept. Scott originally wanted a burning Yule log, but Alec suggested making a game out of it that can be interacted with for the Kickstarter, giving the backers confidence that they're serious about their creation and, in fact, capable of making it. You may have also noticed it gives Alec a mean of actually contributing to this animation. They added Bethany onto the team on February 2014, and a couple months after that, they managed to get a demo out to show off the GDC. Their publisher got them to show up once or twice on E3. I was able to find an interview on E3 2014 where the two were present, but also an E3 2016 interview where only Alec had arrived. Bethany was not present for either, despite her officially being on the team for 4 months after the first event. Scott says he watched Alec on social media and how he would snap pretty viciously at some people, and once that Alec had messaged him drunk that he was gonna run around San Francisco until someone killed him. The next morning, Alec explained explained that he had forgotten to take his meds and that being in crowded spaces had made him anxious. A month or so later, a roommate texted Scott saying that Alec was scaring him. Said roommate suggested that they were worried Alec was going to harm himself or others. When Scott texted Alec on it, he said that it was nothing and that the roommate was being dramatic. Scott seems to be trying to build a case of the red flags he experienced over the years in development of the game, but already I'm seeing an argument between Alec and a roommate. One's word over another. And said roommate decided to call up his business partner from another country that Alec had only met once in person according to his recountings. When the two went to E3, Scott did most of the socializing and Alec covered the technical aspects. They went to a restaurant after the event and Alec had been talking about an ex-girlfriend. It seemed that Alec had only bad things to say about people he's ever dated. When Scott questioned that every ex he had was terrible, Alec got more upset and Scott changed the subject. Alec then said that he was just tired and he didn't know what he was talking about. This seems to state that Alec had a lot of vitriol towards his exes, and at the very least with Zoe that checks out. Unfortunately, I can't access Alec's Twitter, which makes this all the more difficult to confirm or deny. But Scott bringing up how Alec had no good things to say about his ex is mildly amusing, especially considering that Zoe has been documented multiple times claiming their exes had committed scandals against them. So consistently speaking, it would be odd for him to just believe Zoe. But back on Scott's post, a year into Night in the Woods development, Alec's behavior got worse. He grew more paranoid that more people were planning to ruin his life. Anyway, Scott stated that he was shocked by his mood, unstable behavior, and as a fellow med taker, knew what skipping doses might do. Around winter at this point, a couple months they finished Lost Constellation. Alec's mood was boosted by its completion, and he stated that he didn't need a work-life balance, and that work was his life. Scott replied that he lost that mindset when it was imposed on him by jobs he previously had, and Alec said, "Oh god, I had a job once. That was the worst 3 weeks of my life." Scott laughed, but Alec explained that he wasn't kidding, and they sort of moved on. According to Scott, Alec would talk about how he didn't care about money, didn't understand why people didn't like their jobs, didn't just leave them, and that he was baffled that more people weren't doing so to follow their dreams. Which, if true, does make Alec come across as pretty naive. And Scott seems to agree with me because he would be the downer that explains that's not how the world works. But I'm having my doubts on that based on the later parts of the story. Scott and Beth thought that Alec was a rich kid who doesn't understand how life goes because of this. But no, they learned that that was not the case. And Scott states he was just a guy who was clueless about the world who had gotten rich young. But once it was explained by Scott that it isn't that easy, he also says that Alec didn't understand, but picked it up pretty quickly. And once he learned that Scott and Beth didn't like bosses, he had a lot of bad things to say about bosses. And Alec had said that they were a good influence on him. This honestly tells us a bit about both Scott and Alec. Scott's dislike towards bosses reflects in the game, and Alec's early success may explain why he may have not grasped these things and would take these ambitious leaps. But I'm generally shocked that Scott didn't even seem to take Alec's statement to heart. Further in the story, according to Scott, during GDC 2015, Alec suffered a multiple day-long break and was physically threatening to those around him. His paranoia was worsening, and he was burning every bridge possible, or at least that's what it seemed like from his distant vantage point. Remember, for the majority of this story, they are a country apart, so judging by the GDC's date that year, around early March 2015, Alec had paused working on the game. Scott also states that his health was declining from panic attacks and sleep paralysis, feeling the pressure that Alec held their future in his hand as he paused his career for this, and yet they made no recent progress on the project. Scott lamented that he was getting deeper in debt even with the help of their publishers. Okay, I gotta pause again because this is a lot. Alec supposedly stopped working on the game early to late 2015. It's kinda hard to track here since I can't access Alec's Twitter. Beth said on the Night in the Woods Twitter really mentioned nothing on being on a sort of bump in the road in that regard. Obviously they wouldn't bring it up though because it looks bad on the project for it to bring up friction like this. But it doesn't help that I can't find any reliable footprints on his claims. I tried even going to the Kickstarter updates, but that proved fruitless for obvious reasons. I can't even access the Twitch streams they had. The only thing I can make out of this was that there was a third less updates than in 2016 and 2017. Also, how the hell were they in debt at this point? They had been funded $200K, 400% past their goal, and were also getting funding from their publishers at Finji. They weren't even into the second year of development yet. Where on earth did all the money go if this were true? It reads like Scott was trying to find more ways to exaggerate how much pressure was being applied to him at the time. Remember how he worded working full-time on a video game with a stranger that he agreed to, especially when he can't find any mention of the developed heart problems or panic attacks he reports on in this post, during or after the fact. 3 months pass and Scott finally decides that he's going to work without Alec from this point forward to pull the project along. He states that he proceeded to redesign the game a full 7 times trying to get Alec motivated to work on the project, saying that Alec would respond with a disinterested whatever or that looks too difficult when it was made. Which I highly doubt this is the case. I'm assuming he came up with 7 different concepts of the game. I doubt Scott was redesigning the entire game 7 times over because not only is that something he's incapable of doing, allow me to remind you that he himself states that Alec was doing all the code work. It's also incredibly impractical. After the second or third whatever, you'd think you would just spitball the concept art page for whatever comes into your mind. Either way, there was no way he was redesigning the entire game a little over once a month on average.
This is the first version of it. We're not using any of Unity's particle systems or colliders. We're kind of doing our own weird stuff. And this is, the cool thing about Unity is I can implement this, right? And I get it working kind of okay, like it looks all right, but then Scott can get a hold of all the parameters and tweak them so that they actually look a lot better. So in this case, he actually slows them down so you can kind of see them waving through the air back and forth, which is like a sine wave turned to its side.
He talks about how his panic attacks were getting worse and that Bethany started hating Alec for what he was doing to me on a weekly basis, eventually going into therapy, and he came to terms that he wasn't responsible for Alec's feelings here. He then talked quite a bit about his past and how he was in denial of being abused by Alec. Alec was enrolled in a 5-week intense therapy program and he was put on new meds that seemed to be mellowing him out, although there was still radio silence during then. Alec would start working on the game when Scott's taking care of large parts of the animation work, making it easier for him to visualize what he's working with, I imagine. Scott states that he still has those videos. I kinda wish he posted them to support his claims because it's not in this post, the Twitter thread he linked it in, nor his personal YouTube page. At some point in December, while Alec's mood was still in a downward slope, Scott began working 7 days a week on the game, and he states once more a decline in his physical and mental well-being. They talked to the publishers about their situation, and eventually reached out to Alec and started trying to work things out. What happened next was something Scott and Beth would joke about being a Christmas miracle. Bethany had decided she had enough of Alec, and created a private Twitter account to vent to some of her friends about everything. Over a couple dozen tweets of her talking about how Alec was ruining their lives, how cruel he was to them, and how Scott needed to step up and do most of the work. Scott got a message from Alec with a screenshot of the messages, and his message being okay. Beth had forgotten to make her account private, and it got trailed back to Alec most likely as she referenced some other games he's been working on, and he was likely notified by that mention. Scott rushed to Bethany across the neighborhood and she deleted the account. The publishers talked to Alec, and within a few days he was practically a different person. According to Scott, he said he understood what he'd done and went back to work on the game consistently. Scott says in 2016 he was still having regular panic attacks, but they mellowed out some. Alec had went through worksheets in therapy, was very retentive towards them, and brought said worksheets when he visited to in spring in hopes that it would help them too. And Scott admits that at least one of those methods had come in handy. They spent the day assembling the game with the design documents he put together a year prior. They at this point had a form of start and finish. And Scott says, in 2013 we aimed to make a 3 to 4 hour game. The 80% empty version of it was 5.5 hours long. This thing was larger than we anticipated. Which, doing the math in my head, had me wondering, Scott supposedly was doing the majority of the work mid to late 2015. He decided to begin picking up development on the game in June, and Alec was back on by late December 2015 to January 2016. They started the actual project by early 2014 and seemed to have a concept down more or less. Scott's going over how he was pushing himself to the physical limit of development for this game in the period of 2015, yet when Alec comes in and they start working on it together, only then do they seem to have 20% of the game complete. And if the story was true, it'd be safe to assume Scott played a big part of the framework that was even put together. But Scott himself has waited about 1/5 complete by this point, which makes me suspect that the workload wasn't as intensive as he states. He was mostly sticking to the animation, writing, and making design documents, not trivial things mind you, but things he was doing anyway, and with Bethany had help in writing. He certainly wasn't creating parts of the full game himself. He doesn't seem to bring it up, but he was counting on Alec coming back, or something happening involving Alec, because it was literally impossible for him to make any progress otherwise. Whether it means that the game's levels were all there but 80% of the assets were missing, or that only enough of the main story options were available to progress through the plot to the end, or anything else that could count as 20% of the game complete, we can't know for sure. But what we do know in this claim is, as soon as Alec returns, they have the skeleton of it complete in less than a couple weeks. And now I'm just thinking about how this was all seemingly resolved by them talking to the publisher, and Alec stumbling across Bethany's venting post, meaning they never directly confronted Alec on this, and doing so would have solved the problem, which I still think is far better than the alternative, which Alec took incredibly well, considering this feeds into the exact paranoia that Scott was worried about. But I'll make more observations by the end. For now, let's talk more about Scott's perspective. Before they left, they drove Alec to all the places that Night in the Woods was inspired by, including Vandergrift, the reference for the town center of Possum Springs, the Blacklick mining graveyard, and other places where inspiration was drawn. He took Alec to the Hill of Altoona, where he saw a kid climb out onto the roof of his house to read and avoid the screaming of the adults inside, which was actually the source of the inspiration of the fan favorite character Lori. He talked with Alec over dinner, how he had changed for the better, had his own apartment, and had a podcast about mental health issues where he was open about his struggles. Scott encouraged him to reach out and make amends with people he had hurt in the past, and Alec said that he was doing so to the best of his ability. He was still presenting bits of paranoia of others ruining his life. Scott said he felt like he was actually becoming friends with Alec, or more akin to a cousin. By September, they had a nearly completed version of the game, and had a release date lined up. Scott states that he hasn't stopped working those 7-day weeks since 2015. Alright, there is something I want to cover here. In the archives, Scott said he hadn't stopped working those 7-hour days, but in the one as of the day of recording, it was edited to say he hadn't stopped working those 7-day weeks. Now, I don't believe for a solitary second that he at any point worked 18 hours a day for 7 days a week, like he claimed on Twitter once. Nobody who works that much posts on Twitter as frequently as Scott, but with further inspection, I suspect he wasn't trying to admit that he was working part-time before this, or that he thought 7-hour shifts were unbearable, but that he had simply made an error in writing. Before this point, he was talking about how he was now working full-time with Alec after the Kickstarter, and when he phrases it, he says, "I never stopped working those 7-day work weeks since 2015, making it very likely he was referring back to the earlier part of the writing, stating that he was working 7 days a week. However, there is also the genuine possibility he did mean this and it wasn't a flub, and that he was trying to emphasize that he was working 7 hours every day of the week with this detail. He would still be working full-time before then if he was taking 2 days off, as he would have been working 35 hours a week before then, and working 45 around this point. But honestly, this feels like a stretch, and what's more likely is that he simply misworded what he said. Either way, it feels hollow coming from someone who works on their passion project funded by thousands of people, backed by a publishing team, and has admitted spending a lot of their time writing the story of Night in the Woods at a coffee shop he frequents. No, I'm not making this up. Scott tells of having passed out at one point due to lack of sleep, and waking up with a head wound as well as constant panic attacks. And although we don't have undeniable evidence of this happening, Scott has been consistent with the kitchen floor incident testimony in the past. But also along with this post, Scott talked about how his worst experience was actually the workload leading up to Night in the Woods release, and nothing really compared. No talk about his experience in 2015 in this. But after the industry event, Bethany and Scott met some friends for dinner, and they asked about the game launch and how it felt. Scott says that before he knew it, he broke down completely and told the whole story of the past few years, and was in a panicked state of fear since there was the possibility that Alec had overheard them. Scott specified he wasn't afraid of Alec as a person, but the condition of the development had put him in the state of mind that he couldn't shake, and he was under the delusion that he wasn't being abused, as the narrative in his head at the time was that they teamed up to make a game, the person in question went through a rough time, Scott learned how to make a game, his partner got better, and the team finished the game, and a therapist later diagnosed him with PTSD. I guess now's a good time to mention he doesn't seem to ever talk about this before this post or after. The most I could confirm is that he did talk about having a lot of stress just before the game's release. Scott decided not to work with Alec again back in 2015, and warned friends who asked him back then to never work with him. He confided with a small group of people of what happened as well as Bethany. Some of his friends were very upset with Alec, to the point where one offered to kick his ass. A lot of local friends were ready to throw down. Good friends offered to throw down. Honestly, not seeing a lot of regret about this towards someone you had seen as a friend or even a form of family once you got past that hurdle. Scott says that he asked the people who knew not to tell anyone. Brilliant, may I add. The people you told your side of the story to the point where they were wanting to assault the guy. I'm sure their lips were sealed. He likely said this because having this come out during development would come more at the expense of the game. And Scott said that he was too exhausted to handle a big public thing with Alec. He also states that he was far too removed from Alec's social circles to understand the full picture in that regard, stating this meant that he had no contact with people who had similar experiences, and lots of other people who had similar experiences with Alec never told me, or anyone. It's common. I wasn't keeping Alec's secret, I was keeping mine. That's how this happens. But Scott reflects on how Alec had changed, and by 2019, Alec had a new team, he hasn't been a problem in years, was doing conferences, made new friends, and seemed to be sharing healthy relationships. He heard good things from both Alec and the people who hung out with him, but the happy story didn't last forever. He had gotten recountings of other people close to Alec and knew him years ago, as well as people who knew him now, and was shocked by them having similar experiences. Then Scott states that allegations about Alec's behavior from right before we knew him came out a week before this post was made, referring to the response of Zoe Quinn's allegations, and they were backed up by people he trusted. Scott says that suddenly Alec's resentment towards his exes made sense in that moment, as well as other comments he made over the years. Scott says that he reached out to Alec on the allegations, he gave a non-committal response, and Scott never heard from him again. After this, Scott states that multiple other people came forward about how he had treated other people like Scott was treated back in 2015. They discovered Alec at fault for the indie house cutting ties with him, and that he's a shitty boss. He found out women were afraid of him, and that people who worked with him gone through the same thing Scott had, and these people were being siloed off and given responsibilities for his actions. Scott then says he doesn't think Alec did this consciously, that he knew some of the paranoia was his condition, but this awareness didn't stop his behavior and thus led to a state of trying to act threatening while feeling under constant threat. Scott then says this is how he could entrap multiple women over the years and still think that they were out to get him, and that he had a common habit of threatening suicide. So Scott not only believes Zoe's allegation, but doubles down and thinks that Alec had entrapped other unnamed women, potentially other people he heard testimonies from. Many people messaged Scott and said that they knew about him and apologized for not speaking up sooner. He says he's writing this too late, and whatever Alec actually felt, all that remains now is the consequences of his actions. I know, we're almost done. Scott then says that Alec would shift to new cities, teams, and people whenever it became too much. And after a lot of hard thinking and checking up, they announced that they were going to cut ties with Alec. And how it's not a firing because they're not a company but a collaboration. And that they weren't working on any big money projects that he'd no longer be a part of. It is worth pointing out that Scott states on a post for the Kickstarter backers that Alec still got a cut of the money from the game and soundtrack sales. There's no benefit to actually saying this to the Kickstarter backers, especially when the allegations just dropped. I have no reason to believe he's lying. They still do get profits from merchandise as well as the physical copies that they recently released. He also says that Alec never considered Night in the Woods his game after the 2015 absence, and wanted to someday make something that was his, and that Alec quickly moved on after finishing up the content patch and bug fixes. While assuming Scott's talking about the Weird Autumn expansion, that moves the last post of development from early 2017 to the end of 2017, which I would hardly call quickly moving on. The Weird Autumn expansion was a great update, but the game could have managed perfectly fine without it, and the old Infinite Ammo website had Night in the Woods along with Aquaria as his portfolio. Whether Alec said it or not, he very clearly felt like this was his game too. Night in the Woods had 3 different albums, with hours of music in 2 of them. That, along with his coding skills being obviously integral for this game getting off the ground. I wouldn't have let him sell himself short like that despite what he thought, and neither should Scott. He then says, "While I praise Alec's work, consider this. People left the industry because of what he did. People gave up their dreams, the art they wanted to make. People, drawn by the promise of working with a well-known indie developer, found themselves caught between giving up their dreams and financial stability and getting away from him. People spent years with him as a destructive presence in their lives. People developed PTSD. People spent hours and money on therapy. People felt trapped by him. It's hard for me to see how one man's work is worth what he did to so many others." He continues that Alec had the prestige and money to continue the cycle, leaving them abandoned when they became dependent on him, and that his approach to relationships is childish and abusive. And if it weren't for the persistence of them and the publishers, and the legal obligations of a Kickstarter, that Alec would have dropped out, but that their success gave him more prestige to lure people in. God, Alec just can't win. Scott somehow knew that he was going to give up on the project and leave Scott with everything, but also knew he wanted to stay so that he could get the success of the game to lure more people into working with him. He was stuck because of the legal obligations of Kickstarter, huh? Whose idea was it to put it on Kickstarter again? Reading this has been somewhat difficult, but there was a point where I just had to stop. I took a break from writing, and it's from what comes up next. And that's that he had survived Alec Holowka. A statement that was in the original and edited version of this. Scott had not only chosen to make this statement with his choice of words after Alec's suicide, but chose to keep it in. Moving on. He then states he feels stupid in hindsight for thinking this was an isolated case, and had been made aware of it all in the span of the week this all happened. And it pretty much ends there. I know that was long and exhausting, but I want you to get a good synopsis of what Scott had to say about Alec 3 days after he took his own life. With no names or sources to back up the post, I'd like to add, I had to go find them myself. The people Scott was referring to who worked with Alec and had posted something on the matter is Maddie Torson, whose tweets have been purged since she moved on to her website Thanks Wayback Machine, which was a vague tweet of her saying she believed Zoe, was shocked by Alec's behavior, but not surprised. I couldn't find anything from Kyle Pulver, nor anything from Derek Yu, someone he worked with frequently. The other story I could find of someone else who had worked with Alec was Albertine Watson, who claims Alec hit on her back in 2018. According to her, she shot him down and Alec attempted to remove her from the project. She also states that she was angered that the leading person of her team had abandoned them during these accounts, and that Alec didn't reach out to her felt disrespectful on a personal level. Mind you, this was posted before it was made public that Alec killed himself. But it feels oddly callous that she expected Alec to just be on the ball and ready to deal with all of this out of the blue, especially when you yourself seem to be prepared to drop a story about him being abusive as well. Actually, that's not fair. Most of what she listed could hardly constitute as abuse. She talks about how Alec tried to drop her from their work, which they refer to as Project Potato, after she turned down his advances back in January 2019. But we only have her word, as she kept it a secret from the rest of the team members. Alec apparently didn't go through with it, and nothing has come out of it. And according to Albertine, Alec never pushed the subject. Completely deniable, but it would have been Albertine's word against someone who was being accused of a lot of terrible behavior recently, meaning it would be a lot easier for people to believe this at face value. She also says around spring and summer 2019, Alec had really soured towards her and it felt like he despised her very presence. Which if that's the case, he had an odd way of expressing it since she was the co-host of Infinite Ammo podcast, a podcast that began after January 2019 and was taking place during spring and summer. She wasn't present on the last upload on August 2019, but we don't know the reason why. What we do know is that she still edited that episode as she was given credit for doing so on the Infinite Ammo's Twitter post announcing it. So our only real evidence of Alec's nature was the accounts of Scott, his wife, and a few other people who worked with him. And it doesn't seem to occur to any of these people that even if they all come together and confirm that Alec was in fact a terrible person to work with, that they are ultimately using this information as evidence when it is ultimately irrelevant to the allegation that Alec did in fact entrap and rape Zoe Quinn. Saying that Alec was a jerk doesn't suddenly give you credence to go, yeah, he probably did it. Scott's response felt especially shameful because he was slandering a dead man shortly after, now that he can't defend himself, yet didn't pull up anything supporting his claims when he himself had admitted he was not working with Alec in person for the majority of the development time. All of it boils down to him being spineless and not telling Alec he was either not ready for that level of commitment for a project of that magnitude, or to actually confront Alec back in 2015 when he was being abusive by not carrying his weight and Scott causing self-inflicted harm by overexertion. And I feel the need to emphasize this was trying to conclude that other accusations made about him were true, including Zoe's, which was incredibly specific on allegations of isolation and sexual assault, all of which sound like, at best, assuming this is all accurate and honest, Alec was a terrible person to work with despite his talents. I frankly find the attempts at trying to make a connection between an incident during game development where he wasn't carrying his weight and entrapping a woman rather disgusting. Scott claims he cared about Alec, while simultaneously telling us that he had been spreading word to never work with him while they were developing a game together, which only put it further into question with him working longer with Alec to make the Weird Autumn update. Scott claims he cares about Alec, but then booted him from Infinite Fall after a bunch of horror stories have came to him, which only arrived after the Zoe Quinn allegations, seemingly never spoken in private. Scott claims he cared about Alec while immediately believing his ex's vague accusations from 7 years ago, with seemingly not the faintest doubt on the matter for the person he admits was the only reason the game got off the ground and had built the very foundation May walks on. Nobody would know who the hell Scott was without Alec. He'd still be a struggling artist, and now he's saying these things about a dead man who can't defend himself under the guise of being a survivor of abuse that in his writing was self-inflicted and immediately relieved when someone accidentally talked to the supposed abuser about it, and that he learned these terrible things about him and how he didn't actually change, and he only learned about all of this after Zoe's allegations came out. Then he made an informed decision. It's apparent I don't think Scott remotely cares about Alec, considering how dismissive he is of the positive things Alec had done in his life. Alec brought together this project, encouraged Scott to brainstorm and create Night in the Woods as a concept, and although Scott and Beth wrote the setting that many people would be endeared towards, Alec had set the code. He had put together the music that reinforced those moments into memories. Alec had made more music for this game than some other single-player games get, with 10 times its length. This piece reads like an attempt to reinforce Scott's assumption Alec did all the things Zoe claimed he did to them, and now it's retroactively being written as a case of abuse. He can't be caught siding with Alec in this tidal wave or else his reputation would be ruined too. And remember, before Alec, Scott was barely able to get a living in the art industry. Now that he's gone, Scott especially can't afford to be wrong. But Scott wasn't the only one who had an egregious response to Alec's death, as Zoe had wrote about it a couple weeks after, and the things they had to say also caught my attention. It'll be quicker, I promise. Gonna skip the first note for now and move on to the second, where they feel unfairly responsible for every victim Alec had had in the past 8 years. And that felt like a tidal wave because the very same week, they learned that one of the men they trusted most had sexually abused another woman, and they cut him out of their life. This guy doesn't go named, and I'm not sure if Zoe ever mentions him again. Much like in the Alec allegations, there's yet another grand tragedy to add on top of the pile as they recount their story. But going back to the first note, Zoe explains how no one coming forward about abuse they faced and telling their story is responsible for their abuser's suicide. Which, yes, I actually agree with Zoe here. The thing is, Zoe does not agree with Zoe here. We've seen them present behavior during Gamergate that shows a stance where they believe their ex Eron was in some way responsible for the bad things that people did to them. They alluded to it repeatedly in the affidavit for the purpose of trying to give the charge ground to stand on. You might call that a non sequitur. One might argue that Zoe's referring to victims here and Eron was not a victim. Well, first off, I highly disagree with that, but it's very well known that Zoe did these things, and Eron took great measures to avoid, disavow, and discourage any occurring distasteful actions towards Zoe. Meanwhile, Zoe posted this publicly on Twitter while spouting empty platitudes about wanting him to get rehabilitation, as if not knowing damn well what was going to happen. Zoe was prepared to share the credit for Maya's actions towards the young capitalist up until the repercussions could have been negative. Zoe's completely willing to argue that people are not responsible for the actions of others so long as it's convenient for them to have that stance. But in the end, Alec had made the decision to take his own life. Zoe did not kill Alec Holowka. But they might as well have. I've been waiting a while to talk about this in detail, but some people may note that Alec's silence followed by his suicide gives off the idea that he was guilty, or that Zoe standing up to him was merely the final nudge for him to go over the edge. But I really want to set stage for the absolute scale of destruction that this one tweet had. So let's go through this a bit in the perspective of Alec. Obviously I can't read his mind, but we can go over a lot of what went down and it becomes clear just how bad this was. Okay. You've been a game developer pretty much your entire career. You've made yourself stand out after responding to Jack Thompson back in the day with his letter, A Modest Video Game Proposal, and made him look like a quack while practicing your game creating skills. You talked to one of the people on that project about a game you had in mind and have been working on for a bit. He gains interest and wants to make that game a reality. Your work comes to life, and you and your partner win the grand prize at the Indie Game Festival. Your wild success giving you a solid amount of funding as well as a reputation in the indie gaming scene. You start working on smaller projects with other people, many of which no one will ever really hear about. In the span of 2 years, you're involved in another project that gets an IGF award. Then you make music for Offspring Fling, an alright game by the eyes of the indie public, and Towerfall Ascension, a game that had a lot more eyes on it. While you're in the works on Towerfall, you come across a guy whose posts you think are funny, and you like his art style. You decide to message him and ask if he wanted to make a video game with you. You get him to agree, and since you're in charge of soundtrack and coding, you find it appropriate that he comes up with concepts so that he can work with that and you can play off it. He gets a concept down, but he can't work on it regularly while maintaining his job as a freelance artist. So you encourage him to go through said idea and get a Kickstarter funded. After 4 grueling years, you, Scott, and Beth completed the game, and it's wildly successful, to the point that anyone involved could probably put their foot through any future door by being one of the Night in the Woods devs. It wasn't easy. It brought you and Scott to a near breaking point, and you know that Beth is furious at you, and you're nowhere near proud of your work schedule in 2015. But you managed to do it, and are even able to work on the Weird Autumn update. You suffer from some mental disorder, something that brings about mood swings and easy irritation, and something that has not only been a problem to you, but for the people you work with. It doesn't justify you being shitty towards them, and part of you knows that. For one reason or another, you have been getting help with therapy and medication on it. Results vary on how well that's working out. Your paranoia hasn't completely subsided, but it's better than ignoring it. A year and a half later, after you've completed the last large project on that game, one of your exes comes in with an allegation of you entrapping and sexually assaulting them, and you're left speechless. The replies are a sea of identical, "we believe you" and "I'm sorry," and no doubt you're getting plenty of messages on the matter, some of which from people you've worked with before, but you're not sure what to say. Your ex is well known throughout some circles of the internet as a champion against harassment of women, or a pathological liar, and in your circle, it's the former. Tons of people not only say they believe her, but some pressure others to as well, one of which being the composer of Crypto the Necrodancer. Old coworkers air out dirty laundry as well as forms of their own testimonies, whether true or not, to try to corroborate Zoe's allegations. Your partner on Night in the Woods has booted you off of Infinite Fall in a public display of believing Zoe with an approval of their publisher. Your video game career is dead. You've been in the industry for over a decade now, and it got sunk in a week by a Twitter post with a story openly contradicted by the person on the exact same account. You've made your label for years now as a supporter of getting more women in the gaming industry. Everyone you knew has either turned their back on you or openly sided with Zoe. Even your family knows about the story. Nobody's going to work with you at the risk of having their own reputation immediately tarnished. Any project you do solo will have your name on it and thus shunned by everyone else. From this point forward, you can no longer make a living on the thing you're most passionate about. Your presence online is done for, so you can't go elsewhere with all that digital knowledge you've collected. If you're lucky, you can silently do freelance work under a pseudonym. But more likely than not, you're going to have to find a new job entirely with no real experience in your mid-30s. You are nothing more to the public as the Night in the Woods guy who raped and held Zoe Quinn captive. And you're alone. Make no mistake, this is no straw that broke the camel's back. This was the complete erasure of a man's career and reputation that he cultivated online for 12 years, and now he's gone unmourned by the majority of the people he worked with. Plenty of people in indie circles believed he did the things he was accused of unsubstantiated, and Zoe continues their career during and after, posting one response to the allegations, then posting pictures of their dog and their goddamn DC comic. Don't worry, Zoe got Marvel too, and their own comic Goddess Mode, which was in the progress of being made while this was going on, and got completed. I said this earlier, but Zoe claims they did this believing in rehabilitation. And all the things I've read in this chapter, this is probably the cheapest and most insulting lie sold. Zoe's entire campaign was against the Zoe post for putting private conversations in public, leading to public harassment. During their feud with the fine young capitalists, they stated how much they value privacy unless brought to an extreme. And before anyone says being abused is obviously an extreme, I'll reiterate that Zoe was one of the biggest names for an anti-harassment movement 5 years prior, yet decided to do this now of all times. Zoe threw this all out like the ex they condemned, minus the whole posting evidence part, and at least their ex had the decency to not originally do so on Twitter of all places. Then the expression of shock of others coming out reveals to me that Zoe at no point tried to contact those close to Alec prior. Zoe's made no attempt to dispute this privately, no intervention, making it all the more likely that there was nothing to actually dispute in the first place. And Zoe had no interest in rehabilitation like they claimed. They saw someone making allegations towards the Skyrim composer, and went, I could do that too. Zoe then would talk about how they were considering suicide themselves after the event. It was now using his sister's letter on his death as a shield in the first part of the response. Aline Holowka, Alec's sister, wrote a post on October about the whole thing, and on transformative justice. The writing pretty much all but gives away that she wasn't very happy with how people conducted themselves during the allegation. She specifies Alec's death was not to prove a point, and that he was working on a statement the day before his suicide. And according to her, Alec had been quiet as he was trying to find an acceptable but true way to respond, which only led to people piling onto the allegation harder as he was silent, which we do know that part is true. Part of me didn't want to put this in because the whole point of this post is to not use Alec's death as ammunition, and part of me paused as I realized I was the person Aline is worried about. But no. Leading to more strife is no excuse to allow for all this to go unanswered, and I have no intentions of dropping this just because it's uncomfortable. I recommend giving her letter a read-through, because it's honestly more tasteful and grounded than Scott's post, which, speaking of which, he had a joke posted on the same day. Speaking of really poor timing, but as insanely insensitive as this was to post a month after his co-worker's suicide after the death of his career, it was just that. It was a coincidence and not in response to Aline's post. Aline tweeted the Medium post several hours after, so there's no way he saw this before making that tweet, unless she sent it to him privately and he decided in his infinite wisdom to say this. But we have zero evidence of that and nothing he would accomplish doing so, making this marginally less terrible. With Alec gone, Night in the Woods hasn't seen a lot of activity since the cancellation of the project tied to it back in 2019. As of the time of writing and recording, there hasn't been much activity outside of teasing the physical copy release, but Scott did make an animation in 2021 of Tokei's cover of the song With Any Sort of Certainty, with a much more melancholy interpretation. The animation depicts a photographer haunted by his mortality after his trauma in the war. He struggles with keeping the grasp on reality as he gets photos of a dead woman developed for tomorrow's paper. While he's in his turmoil, his friend who was also in the war and understands what he may be going through has to act as his anchor for reality. It's honestly a touching story that's only held back by the fact that I lied and this was made in 2013. What Scott actually made in 2021 was the Bridgewater Astro League, something that in my opinion was very visually minimalist in an unimpressive way. It's a Night in the Wood-esque comic but in all darkened silhouettes. And before you think, oh, Samurai Jack, no, it doesn't really take any advantage of this visual change, other than if you want to say when one of the characters chews out another and becomes big and scary. Sorta. And whatever narrative it has is just interpretations of part of an album of a band Scott likes. Hence why one of the characters just quotes word for word the interlude of the album. It's not only a downgrade from the visual design of Night in the Woods despite not being limited to video game code or a deadline, it is lower grade content overall than his work back in 2013, which is the reason why I presented With Any Sort of Certainty as a 2021 work. Here he is with an IP 3 years after Weird Autumn, making a borderline monochrome comic of about 30 pages. Doesn't develop confidence for any project Scott and Bethany may have in the works. And if they do and it's of any quality, I'd be shocked if they did it alone. But that is the story of Alec Holowka's allegations and the consequences that came after. Took a lot out of me to go over this, because, unfortunately, this story has no semblance of a happy ending or a light at the end of the tunnel. Although Zoe does not have the same level of relevance as they had in the past, they get to continue with their work of collaboration with other entertainment mediums and fiddling with the 3D printer. And Scott can now ride the Night in the Woods waves into other things if he really wanted to, or maintain a cult following that's developed through the game with more content tied to or close to it. So, what happens now? Well, to put it simply, we don't forget like people would want us to. Assuming this is a version I uploaded, tied to this video is a link to all the sources I've amassed for this entire project. All the sources I've been dropping in the bottom left corner are located in a Dropbox on this burner account. As well as mentioned earlier, there should be a link to download the video if you'd like. Sources and points of references to draw your own conclusions. From an anti-Zoe lens, I know. I can't act like I'm not biased. And I encourage you to do your own research on the matter if you do feel passionately about it. I think the most important thing we can do is remember what happened August 26, 2019. Remember what happened in the indie gaming circles. Who drew their conclusions and how quickly they did so. In short, remember what happened to Alec.